So I have a problem. I'm going to an event and I have nothing to wear. And I think that's part of the issue when you start out in historical costuming. Every time you delve into a new era or you want to go to an event, you have to start completely from scratch. Now, the event that I'm going to has an Edwardian theme, and I'm very familiar with the Edwardian era. I started my career in theatre costuming round about that World War I centenary period, so I did a lot of Edwardian World War I things. I know technically World War I is not Edwardian, but the same sort of style of dress. I did a lot of that in my early career, and I haven't really done any of that since the end of 2018, so I am ready to dive back into it. However, it's me! Of course, there's extra challenges. As ever, we have the mobility aid compatibility issue. Edwardian skirts generally are quite long and trailing and floofy and things. That's not going to work for me. I'm also probably not going to be able to make a long line corset or anything like that because I don't know, I don't think you can really sit down in those. I don't know how that works. There is also a financial issue. Everything you see me make on the channel is funded by the revenue that I make on YouTube and coffee donations, but that's the only way I'm able to afford to make particularly these big grand costuming projects that involve lots of fabric. So I wasn't expecting to have to make this costume, so I wasn't able to budget for it, which means things are tight. I'm going to have to try and make this costume for as little money as possible. The other element, of course, is the time. It's kind of a last minute get together, this event, and I don't have a lot of time to make this costume. And I'm possibly gonna have some freelance work come in, which obviously has to take priority because I actually get paid for that. Yeah, I genuinely don't know whether I'm gonna make it in time. Ooh, the jeopardy. So I guess you better keep watching and find out how this goes. So I've been doing a bit of research into what I think I'm going to need to make, definitely, and this is sort of the good aspect of this design. If anyone is unfamiliar with my good, better, best method, I suggest you watch my Sewing with a Disability video for a more detailed explanation. But what I mean by good here is that this is the bare minimum I need to do to achieve a garment that I am satisfied with. So I'm not going to make a corset, I'm not going to make a brassiere, I'm not going to faff about with petticoats, I don't think. I think what I'm going to do instead is make a princess slip, and these became popular in this era as a sort of corset cover and petticoat combined, and they were to help, you know, create a smooth line. And I think that's the sort of Edwardian look I'm going to go for. So I think I'm just going to make a slip and going to call the undergarments good, really. I began by sketching out a rough idea of what I was going for. You can also see here I did a rough sketch of what I thought the dress was going to look like to figure out what style I needed the slip underneath to be. I went for a very simple princess seam slip dress with a wide boat neck that could be gathered down using insertion lace and a ruffle at the bottom. I also added sleeves to the design, but in the end I scrapped those as I struggled to find any surviving princess slips that had sleeves. As I was trying to make this slip for as little money as possible, I chose to draft my own pattern. So I started with my skirt and bodice blocks and then eliminated the waist seam to create a dress block. I then had to fight with lots of large bits of paper to trace off the various large pattern pieces I would need to make this slip. To begin with, I traced around the back block piece. I used my pattern master to help draw the straight lines as well as the curved sections. As I was doing this, I decided against making the slip in panels, as you traditionally would with princess seams, literally because I could get a similar effect using less fabric and paper by just using the darts already in the block. To transfer the darts, I used a tracing wheel. This leaves little indentations on the paper below that you can then go over with a pencil. It's a really precise way to transfer information and easier than trying to see lines through this heavyweight pattern cutting paper. Once I trace the back dress block, it's time to choose where to put my neckline. For this, I just make an educated guess. It's something you get better at with practice, but it is just a case of drawing lines and looking at it and going, yeah, that looks okay. Add the straight of grain and then work on lengthening the skirt portion of the dress. I'm going for a gentle A-line shape here, and I want it to be long enough that it reaches below my knee where the ruffle will add the remaining length. I label the pattern pieces clearly before doing the same again for the front. Because of the shoulder dart in the block, I ended up with a slightly odd dart configuration, but more on that later. As the front and back are just going to be joined with a strip of lace, rather than make a pattern piece, I just measure how long the lace strap needs to be. Then measure the front and back necklines and do some calculations to figure out the total length of lace I'm going to need. I then just write instructions for how much to cut on the neckline of the back pattern piece. And so with the pattern finished, at this point this project has cost me, well, so far nothing. So this is the funny looking dart on the front of the princess slip. And so I was going to do a seam, and then I decided against it because I couldn't be bothered to seam the long skirt panels. So I'm just going to have a funny dart, I think, and hope for the best. Maybe I'll overlock the seam allowance down so it sort of becomes a seam. You know, quite often Victorians did things like that, a dart that you slash into to make work. So that should be fine. I haven't made the princess slip full length. It's about 60 centimetres from waist to hem. Which is about just below knee on me, and that's because I'm going to put a ruffle on the bottom, and I think that's just going to be a rectangle that I gather down. Nice and easy. Why overcomplicate these things? With the pattern complete, I was able to start cutting out. I'm using this white cotton which has been in my stash for years. I actually think it was left over from a professional job and the company didn't want it back, so I might have gotten this entirely for free. Either way, as it came from stash, I didn't have to spend any money. If I cut my own patterns, I like to cut them as blocks, meaning without seam allowance, which I think is also sometimes called net, but whatever you call it, I had to remember to add seam allowance as I cut. With only the 4 body pieces of the slip to cut, I was soon onto pinning and sewing in the darts. To mark the darts, I had used a tracing wheel, just on its own without any carbon paper. This left very faint markings, but I didn't want to risk using chalk or a friction pen on my white fabric in case it left a stain. As a result, I had to very carefully pin along my sewing lines as I couldn't really see them once under the bright light of the sewing machine. I followed the line of the pins as a guide for sewing, but as I was likely to alter the darts later, I wasn't too worried about it being super precise. Then I joined the side seams. I left 2.5 centimetres of seam allowance along the side seams in case I ever need to alter the slip later. I had originally decided against overlocking the seam allowances, but later changed my mind. So I played with the tension settings on my overlocker until I was happy with it, and then went back and overlocked each layer of the seam allowance separately. This was much trickier to do with the seams already sewn up, but I think it was worth it in the end. I had also left large seam allowances around the armhole and neckline in case I needed alterations, but I was happy with the fit, so I trimmed those down. I also then began cutting the fabric to make the ruffle around the hem. The width and length of the ruffle was simply determined by how much fabric I had left. I would have liked it maybe a little longer, but oh well. To get the rectangle straight, I tore the fabric rather than cutting it, but in places I was so short of fabric that there wasn't enough excess to grab hold of to tear it, so I had to carefully cut along the right thread and then carry on tearing once I'd got enough excess to grab hold of again. I joined the 2 panels I had cut, or rather torn, with the overlocker. This meant I could have a much narrower seam and lose less of the width of the fabric to seam allowance. It's also just quicker, and I still had the overlocker set up, and it was less effort than changing over to my sewing machine again. I then pressed the seams of the ruffle and the ruffle itself as it had gone a little crumpled and distorted through tearing. Then back to the overlocker to neaten both raw edges. To make up for the ruffle being a bit short, I decided to add some lace to the hem. I've had this broderie anglais in my stash for nearly 10 years, and it came from a charity shop originally. Again, like the fabric, I'm calling this free as I've had it for so long I can't even remember how much I paid originally. I'm machining the lace on right sides together. And then flipping the seam allowance up and pressing the lace down from the right side. I then top stitch the seam allowance to the fabric of the ruffle to keep the lace pointing down. Then it was time to gather the ruffle to fit the bottom of the slip. I turned up the stitch length on my machine and ran parallel lines of gathering stitches along the top edge of the ruffle. You can see here I've pressed under the top edge of the ruffle to get a neat hem to the top. As the ruffle was quite long, I marked the midpoints between the seams with a safety pin and made 4 lots of gathering stitches for each quarter of the ruffle. This just makes it easier to get the gathers even and makes it less likely your gathering threads will snap and ruin all your hard work. It seems I now decided it was the moment to neaten all my overlocker threads by threading them back on themselves using a darning needle. I'm not sure why I did this now, perhaps I had just forgotten about it. With that task out of the way, it was time to pull up those gathering threads and machine the ruffle onto the hem of the slip. To make sure my gathers looked nice and pretty, I machined very, very slowly and used a pin to stroke the gathers into place. This helps them lie flat and makes it less likely you'll get weird tucks and puckers. With the ruffle on the hem, it was time to add the insertion lace that was going to act as shoulder straps and create a channel to gather the neckline of the slip. This lace I actually inherited from my great aunt, known as Tante Ingrid, so again I didn't have to buy anything new for this slip. I pressed under the overlocked raw edge of the neckline and machined the lace carefully along the folded edge. I realised when I got to the armhole edge that I hadn't really thought about how I was going to finish the armholes, or the front edge in fact, so I had to backtrack a little. So I've been trekking along with my slip, so it now has lace around the neck. Yeah, I wasn't sure how I was going to finish the armholes, and then I decided to just turn it in and top stitch it. The other issue that I hadn't thought about was I didn't really cut this to have a facing or anything for the fastening at the centre front. It's one of the things I think I just forgot about it. I'm not entirely sure what went wrong there, but there was a moment of madness and I didn't think about how I was going to close this slip. So I've had to sort of fudge the fastening. Essentially what I've done is I just turned in the edge and put a bit of cotton tape on top of it. So now it looks like I've got a facing or a button stand or whatever, but it is literally just a bit of cotton tape top stitched on. And then at the bottom I just snipped so that it overlaps like that and there's a bit poking out. Not ideal, but it's not going to be seen, so I'm kind of fine with it. And as I had suspected, this project has gotten even tighter because I've just had a paid contract come in. Yeah, so for the next 2 weeks, I'm probably going to have to work exclusively on that and do nothing on this project. So I'm hoping to get the slip finished today. I've gone through my button stash and dug out my Tante Ingrid's lingerie buttons. I believe these lingerie buttons, they're like as flat as possible and covered in fabric. So I'm going to stick those on, I'm going to figure out how many of those I want, do the buttonholes and sew on the buttons, and then probably call it a day because I'm really sleepy. All right, let's get on with that. Now, of course, when doing buttonholes, you have to make a sample to check you're getting the right size and your machine tension is set up correctly. And it's also really important to make the sample using exactly the same type and amount of fabric as where you're going to put your actual buttonholes. So for my sample, I machined some cotton tape onto a scrap of my fabric to mimic my makeshift button placket. Once I was happy, I began sewing all those buttonholes. This is my old Bernina here, so I had no one-step buttonhole or memory program for buttonholes, so I just had to mark them as precisely as I could with a friction pen and concentrate really hard. With all the sewing done, I could trim my threads and iron away the friction pen. As I had previously feared, it didn't disappear completely, so I'm really glad I didn't use it for the darts. I cut the buttonholes open and then began lining everything up precisely to make sure I was going to sew my buttons on in exactly the right place. I used pins to mark the placement for the buttons after my experience with the not-so-removable friction pen. Then all I had to do was sew the buttons on, and the slip was complete. As you can probably tell by the decorations, this project was actually finished last October, and it came together in about 3 days. But 3 days for me is probably only about a maximum of 8 hours sewing, so I would say it was very quick and easy to make. The fit isn't perfect, it gapes over the stomach, but I needed the fit to be snug over the hips, so I'm not sure how to combat that. Maybe I'll add a hook. All in all, I really like this slip. It's quite simple, there are definitely frillier Edwardian underthings that survive, but this one is a bit more everyday, and I'm okay with that. This is the kind of project that I'd file under, does the job. Is it the best thing I've ever made? No. Is it an extraordinary feat of design and engineering? No, but I needed a slip to go under an Edwardian dress, and now I have one. So now I can focus my time and energy on actually making the dress. I might have gotten this slip together in a few hours, but will the dress be finished in time for the event? That's going to be my next video, so I guess you'd better subscribe to see how that turns out. Thanks for watching, see you next time. So I have a problem. I'm going to an event and I have nothing to wear. Now that I have my Edwardian slip, it's time to start working on the dress. The design for this dress went through several iterations. I originally intended to recreate a pattern from Nora Waugh's The Cut of Women's Clothes, but as you may remember from my previous video, I'm having to make this project for as little money as possible. And that Nora Waugh dress was originally made in wool, which I just cannot afford. Instead, I went for this brown viscose twill fabric, which I got from Pound Fabrics for £1.50 a metre. A little bit of false advertising there with the name of the shop, but I'm willing to overlook it. This very unhistorically accurate fabric meant that I had to completely rethink my design. But I still wanted to keep the corselet style skirt because that's just so characteristic of this era. However, as you may know if you've watched some of my previous videos, I have scoliosis, which is a sideways curvature of the spine. In fact, I have 2 curvatures, making my spine S-shaped. This means that I have previously avoided making anything this fitted because my body is so asymmetrical. And fitting something like a corset on yourself is hard enough, even when your rib cage, pelvis, and shoulders don't all point in different directions. But I knew that if I wanted to continue making historical costumes, I would one day have to face the fitting nightmare that is making a corset for my wonky body. And for some reason, I chose to do it on a project where I can't spend any money and I've got a 3-week deadline. As this make was so challenging for a number of reasons, the design actually evolved over time. I originally wanted to make a high neck shirt waist style blouse to go with my corselet skirt, but given the tight budget and deadline, I chose to buy some bright white stretch lace, again from Pound Fabrics, for £1.90 a metre, and use a 1980 sewing pattern for an Edwardian, almost prairie-style blouse that I inherited from my German great-aunt. The finished result was just awful. I don't know why I thought I would be able to get anything like a vaguely historically appropriate result from such modern components. I vastly overestimated my own abilities there, and so I had to return to the drawing board and rethink my design again. I finally had something I thought would work, and so it could be put off no more. I had to start cutting what would be the first of many, many toiles for the corselet skirt. To make the pattern, I used the same dress block as my princess slip. I knew that this was going to be much too big for a garment that needed to fit skin tight, but as I knew I was going to have to do a lot of alterations anyway, I'd rather start too big than too small. I used washed calico for all my toiles. I knew I wanted to repurpose the final toile into the lining of the skirt, so that's why I went for proper calico and not old bed sheets or something. The calico I had bought from a different budget fabric shop called Pound a Meter. Again, misleading, as I actually paid £2 a meter. To save on fabric, I'm only cutting the toiles using the top half of my pattern, and to where the skirt starts to flare over the thighs. This calico lining will eventually be reinforced with boning to make the supportive understructure of the corselet skirt. I'm not wearing a proper corset with this dress, so all the shaping needs to come from the skirt lining and interlining. And so as you can see, the first toile is much too big, but that was to be expected. So I began pinning in the excess as best I could on myself. This was of course very tricky on the back, but I managed with the help of the camera. I then machined in those alterations so that I could see how they actually changed the fit. And this is where I started to get a bit self-conscious about just how crooked my back, hips and ribcage are. You can see that when I just stand normally, how the right side of the back practically folds in half because it's so much shorter than the left side. I made so many little tweaks and alterations to this pattern, and I must confess it was such a long and difficult process, I couldn't really bring myself to film it all. I ended up taking out a very strange wedge across the small of my back that was almost like a horizontal dart. In the end, I had to settle for good enough. The fit still wasn't perfect, and I could probably have got it better with the help of a friend and more time, but I was on a deadline, so I had to just make my peace with it and move on. I dismantled the toile and turned the fabric pieces into a paper pattern. I then cut another set of calico pieces that would be the final toile and would become the lining. I reused the pieces from the previous toile to become the interlining. I made them shorter, reaching to just below the hip, and then interfaced them with fusible interfacing. I deliberately used the papery kind here because I wanted that structure, but also because I was using what I had in my stash. You can see the difference it makes to the pattern pieces here. For speed, I used the overlocker to flatline everything together. I just lined the lining and the interlining up and jammed it through the overlocker as fast as I could. I used the blade to neaten up any indiscrepancies in the cutting of the lining and the interlining pieces. Then I could start constructing the whole lining. I pinned all the pieces together precisely along the sewing lines, making sure to match all my balance marks, as I'd added these to make sure I was getting the panels in the right order. Because the pattern pieces were so asymmetrical, there was no way the skirt would fit if I accidentally flipped one of the pieces. To help sew the long seams precisely, I used my machine's tray table and then got to sewing all those panels together. As the finished lining was rather curvy, I pressed all the seams open over my tailor's ham to help set the curves into the fabric. I then quickly machined in some hook and eye tape from my stash so that I could close the lining at the centre back as the finished skirt would close, and then I could try it on once again. As you can see, it's still not great. I had quite a few wrinkles at the waist, and that right back and side seam were still folding in on themselves massively. I made a few more tweaks, just moving the seams in a few places and out in others, But still, there wasn't much improvement, so I decided to try snipping my seam allowance, as this is supposed to eliminate puckers, and adding some boning. I used the sew-in Ridgeline boning, widely hated by historical costumers for its inaccuracy, but honestly I don't mind it. It's cheaper, easier to work with, and more importantly, more comfortable to wear. Plus, if you know what you're doing, you can still get good results. I sewed the bones to the inside of the lining, as I was worried they would show through the lightweight viscous fabric. And the boning and the snipping did improve things. We've still got quite a few strain marks and wrinkles, but the right back no longer folds in on itself, which is good. So with time against me, I called the lining done and moved on to actually making the rest of the skirt, or as it had become at this point, the dress. I used the pattern pieces from the lining to cut the fabric of the skirt, plus the original pattern pieces I had drafted from the dress block to get the angle of the flared skirt right. I hadn't bothered to redraft the full pattern every time I made alterations, just the top third or so. So, as you can see from this hot pink stuff behind me, can you see it on the cutting table there as well, just about? I've had to stop working on my Edwardian project because I've had a paid job come in, which I was expecting, but it should be quite a short job, so I am still hoping that I'm going to make this Edwardian outfit in time. So that's what I've been working on today, and I've got my overlocker out. I've overlocked everything I can, and I'm waiting for things to arrive in the post before I can carry on with the pink contract. So I think what I'm going to do is see if I can sneak in overlocking my skirt panels, which I cut a few days ago now, before the postman arrives and brings me the rest of the things I need to finish this job. The cutting was really difficult. It was really time consuming, really tiring. I had to cut everything single layer, and then I tried to cut the one front piece on the fold single layer as well, and it ended up like completely skewed like this. So I then had to recut it. I also cut the sewing line instead of the cutting line, you know, and I was like, oh, for goodness sake. So I had to recut my front piece, which means I've got less fabric to work with now for the top, the jacket section of this ensemble. But we'll have to make it work, really, won't we? So let's hope I can get this overlocking done before the postman arrives. And then, as if this project wasn't hard enough, why is nothing in my life ever straightforward? So I have just delivered on the deadline for my most recent professional job, which means I am back to working on this Edwardian project. However, I've been having a lot of trouble with my sewing machine this year, but I rang the sewing machine mechanic and I've possibly fucked it really bad as well. Not only have I, yes, definitely got a circuit board fault, but also I've been sewing on this circuit board fault, which means I've possibly caused even more issues for my machine. So that means I've had to get out my backup brother sewing machine, which is currently what the tripod is standing on. Just typical. It's just typical. But at least I can still sew and hopefully make everything ready in time for this event. Thankfully, the construction of the skirt was actually quite simple, just lots of long skirt seams. The tricky part was, of course, getting the panels in the right order, as they have to match the lining exactly. I then tacked in the hook and eye tape again, putting the lining on the dress form and then the skirt fabric over the lining, and then tacked them together on the stand before I started work on draping the top half of the bodice. Like I say, the design had changed so much at this point, I was really just winging it. I started draping what I thought was going to be a jacket, but then I actually decided I didn't have time to make a jacket, so I cut an all-in-one bodice based on this one, just without the princess seams. Before I made up the bodice, I started on adding the decoration. This all came from stash. In fact, these bits of black velvet literally came from my scraps pile. I was really working with what I had here, and I was so short of time, my camera work was getting worse and worse, so I apologise. I cut panels of the black velvet to make a sort of mock collar, based on a few styles of dress I had seen. Then I just turned under the edges and hand-stitched the velvet in place. I left raw edges at the neckline, as I was going to finish those with some sort of facing later. I used scraps of the viscose to make a template for the piece that would go over the shoulders, so that they would be equal on both sides. Then again, cut in velvet, hand sew in place. I had left the bodice deliberately too long, thinking I would try it on with the skirt and decide how much I wanted the bodice to blouse, but I didn't have time, so I literally just cut it and hoped. To add some more texture, I found some black lace in my stash, left over from a previous contract, that I hand-stitched on the folded edges of the velvet. I also added velvet and lace to the cuffs. I had literally just enough lace. And then I had to work on neatening the raw edges around the neckline and cuffs. For this, I made bias strips of the leftover viscose and machined them on right sides together around the neckline. This was tricky with the velvet and this not so high quality machine, so I just went very slowly and used lots of pins. This was a case of less haste, more speed, as I really did not want to have to be unpicking anything at this stage, especially if velvet is involved. I could then roll the bias strips around to the inside and herringbone them in place. I couldn't really press the edge of the neckline to get it crisp because of the velvet, so had to roll the right side around to the wrong side more than I normally would, so that the brown bias was definitely going to be hidden. I also neatened the back opening by turning in the raw edges and herringboning it in place. I must have also overlocked the raw edges of the bodice at some point, but I didn't film that, so I don't know when I did that. I also didn't film inserting the placket into the skirt of the dress or adding the hooks and bars. You can see I didn't have enough bars, so I made a thread bar for one of the hooks near the bottom that are under less tension. I could then join the bodice to the skirt. The bottom edge of the bodice had to be gathered down slightly to fit. This was not really a design feature, just my slapdash cutting, and I'm not sure I like how it looks, but you'll have to wait to see what I mean. As the bodice wasn't going to be under any tension and I had run out of hooks and bars, I used poppers, or snaps, as the centre back closure. Then all that was left was the hem. I went for a shorter than historically accurate hem, just because it's better for me and my mobility needs. I used my hem marker to level the hem and chopped off the excess. I had no idea how I was going to finish the hem, and then I had the bright idea to just bind it in bias binding and it would look like period appropriate hem tape. I had almost a whole roll of black satin bias binding left over from the same contract as the black lace, so I used that and these little clips before running stitching it in place. But as always when you're on a deadline, my thread kept knotting and getting stuck on the little clips, and then it turned out the stitches weren't securing the binding in place at all, so I switched the camera off and finished up the last few bits off screen. And then finally, I had a dress. I did get to wear this dress to my event last October, and I was pleased with it at the time, mostly I think just because I managed to make it in time. What I am really proud of is the fact that I was brave enough to take on such a difficult project to fit. I think I did okay, all things considered, and most importantly, the next time I have to do something like this, it will be much easier. While it's by no means historically accurate, this dress does work for me. Despite being very fitted, it's very comfortable to wear for long periods, even sitting down. And while it's fun to sit for a picture like an elegant Edwardian lady, the reality is I spend most of my time sitting something like this, and that's just as comfy. The hem might be too short, but I think I did sort of get a suitable Edwardian silhouette. And to say I've no corset, just some calico, interfacing and ridgeling boning, I think it's actually a pretty good attempt. The bit I'm not happy about is the way the bodice drapes where it's attached to the skirt. I think I either needed to make it more fitted or much more gathered. It's sort of in a meh, in-between space, and that's just not quite right. The other thing is I think I need to add armpit gussets. As this is an all-in-one sleeve, there's quite a lot of pulling, and I can see that the fabric is already starting to fray there. I don't know, it's just not quite got that pigeon-breasted Edwardian shape. Maybe if I added a bust improver, the silhouette might become more dramatic. To say I threw this together in 3 weeks, despite my wonky body, despite my tiny budget, despite my sewing machine breaking down and all my other usual health concerns, all in all, I think I did okay. It's also really comfy and was perfect for an informal event to just hang out with friends. Most importantly, I had fun, and I hope you did too. Thanks for watching. See you next time.